October 14th, 1942, 03 a.m., near Port-au-Basque, Newfoundland, Canada. The Canadian ferry SS Caribou cut silently through the fog-shrouded waters of the Cabot Strait, carrying 237 passengers and crew. Below deck, families sleep, believing they are safe within the protected waters of the St. Lawrence Seaway, far from the war's main theater. Suddenly, a violent, metallic roar tears through the night. The U-boat's torpedo hits with devastating force. Captain George Miller, blinded by steam and smoke, screams, "Abandon ship, abandon ship," in the chaos. As lifeboats are lowered, the silent, black hull of the German submarine U-69 briefly surfaces to observe its work before melting back into the darkness. The war had officially arrived on Canada's doorstep. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest, most continuous military campaign of World War II. It was a struggle for supply, a desperate race to ferry food, oil, and munitions from North America to the besieged United Kingdom for the German U-boat fleet, led by Admiral Karl Dönitz. The Atlantic was their hunting ground. And by 1942, they had discovered an entirely unexpected and seemingly undefended killing field, the St. Lawrence Seaway. The St. Lawrence Seaway was Canada's vital artery, a massive inland water route extending from the Atlantic deep into the industrial heartland of North America. Strategically, Allied naval planners had initially dismissed the Gulf of St. Lawrence as a low-risk zone, believing that the narrow, shallow waters and the distance from the main Atlantic battles made it functionally impossible for German U-boats to operate effectively. The Royal Canadian Navy, RCN, was focused on the mid-Atlantic gap, leaving the home waters tragically vulnerable. This strategic miscalculation led to a period that became known as the Battle of the St. Lawrence, 1942-1944. A crisis that brought the full horror of the war directly to the Canadian and American home fronts. German U-boat aces, the highly trained veteran captains responsible for sinking the most Allied tonnage, quickly realized the opportunity. The U-boats, primarily Type 7C, were powerful and versatile. They were designed for the deep Atlantic, but their captains quickly mastered the tricky currents and shallow depths of the Gulf. For these German sailors, the St. Lawrence was a secure hunting ground. Why was it so secure? Low patrol density, the RCN and the United States Navy, USN, had minimal anti-submarine warfare, ASW, presence in the Gulf. Complacent convoys, merchant vessels and ferries operating within the Gulf were often poorly protected or sailed independently. Convinced of their relative safety, complex terrain, the tricky tides, shoals, and fog of the Gulf provided excellent cover for submerged U-boats, making aerial detection extremely difficult. The consequences were immediate and terrifying. The U-boat captains, led by veterans like Otto von Bülow, U-404, and Rolf Mützelberg, U-203, penetrated deep into Canadian waters. They didn't just target military convoys, they attacked coastal shipping, iron ore carriers, and even passenger ferries, causing unprecedented fear among the civilian population. The sinking of the SS Caribou was the flashpoint. The ferry, sailing between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, was torpedoed in the dark of night. Of the 237 souls aboard, 137 were lost, including many women and children. This was not a distant naval battle. This was mass civilian carnage on Canada's home waters. The attack galvanized the Canadian public, demanding an immediate and overwhelming military response. The sinking of the Caribou was followed by the destruction of the HMCS Raleigh, a Canadian minesweeper. The U-boats were operating with impunity, often sinking ships in sight of Quebec's Gaspé Peninsula and Newfoundland's shoreline. The economic and psychological toll was unsustainable. The vital flow of iron ore from Quebec to the steel mills of the US and Canada, essential for manufacturing tanks and ships, was severely threatened. The St. Lawrence, meant to be a safe, internal highway, had become a killing field. The sheer audacity of the U-boat operations fueled German confidence. Their aces believed that no nation, especially one so heavily invested in the mid-Atlantic escort duties, could rapidly redirect the necessary industrial and military resources to seal off a seaway the size of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They assumed that the sheer logistical requirements of manufacturing hundreds of patrol vessels and mobilizing a massive air patrol fleet made an effective, short-term blockade impossible. Their arrogance was rooted in reality. The scale of the challenge for Canada was colossal. The ship gap. The RCN needed dozens of dedicated, modern anti-submarine escort vessels. Producing them would require diverting resources from the primary Atlantic campaign. The air gap, the Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF, required long-range patrol aircraft, training, and dozens of new coastal airfields to effectively cover the vast Gulf. The time constraint. Every week of inaction meant more sunk ships and dwindling morale. Yet, this crisis ignited a fierce, nationalistic resolve. The Canadian government, spurred by public outrage and strategic necessity, made a historic, seemingly irrational commitment. The St. Lawrence Seaway would be closed to German U-boats, no matter the cost, and the response would be immediate. This decision set the stage for one of the most remarkable acts of wartime industrial mobilization in North American history. A race against time to build an entire defensive fleet in a matter of months. A feat the German aces believed was utterly impossible. The clock was ticking on the German secure hunting ground. Late 1942. War Cabinet meeting. Ottawa, Canada. Prime Minister William Lyon. Mackenzie King stands before a large map of the St. Lawrence Seaway, its waters marked with ominous red pins, each one a sunken ship. The loss figures are staggering, the public panic palpable. He pounds his fist on the table, silencing the room. The Americans are focused on the Atlantic Gap. The British are bleeding in the Mediterranean. This is our war, on our doorstep. We need a solution, not a request for help. I want that seaway sealed. Give me a plan, a fleet, and an air patrol. And I want it done in 90 days. The sheer audacity of the demand hangs heavy in the air. Securing a seaway this vast in 3 months is an industrial fantasy. The brazen U-boat attacks of 1942, culminating in the sinking of civilian ships like the SS Caribou in the St. Lawrence, forced the Canadian government into an unprecedented strategic commitment. The realization that German U-boat aces considered the heart of Canadian waters a secure hunting ground was both a national insult and an existential threat to the Allied war effort. If the St. Lawrence Seaway, the transit point for iron ore, grain, and munitions destined for the American industrial heartland, could not be secured, the entire logistical foundation of the Western Allies was at risk. The crisis demanded a response that bypassed conventional military timelines. The standard procedure for acquiring and deploying a dedicated anti-submarine fleet would take a year or more, requiring Canada to pull vital assets from the high-priority mid-Atlantic convoys. The War Cabinet understood that they could not wait. The U-boats were winning the war of attrition right on their doorstep. The mandate issued by Prime Minister Mackenzie King was radical. A full national mobilization to seal the St. Lawrence Seaway in just 90 days. This was the impossible challenge. 90 days was barely enough time to draft the blueprints for a single warship, let alone create the integrated fleet of ships and aircraft necessary to patrol thousands of square miles of complex coastal waters. It required Canada to transform its industrial output and military focus overnight. The immense logistical and technical hurdles were immediate. The industrial bottleneck. Canada was already producing corvettes and other naval vessels at a furious pace for the general Atlantic effort. Fulfilling the 90-day mandate meant accelerating this production to an unsustainable level, diverting resources, and effectively demanding that Canadian shipyards achieve a miracle output during the harsh winter months. The training gap. A fleet is useless without a crew. Thousands of new sailors had to be recruited, trained in the complex tactics of anti-submarine warfare, ASW, and deployed immediately, often with minimal practical experience. The technological integration. The defensive system required advanced technology, sonar, ASDIC, and air-to-surface vessel, ASV radar, which were still rare, bulky, and difficult to install rapidly. Every corvette and patrol aircraft needed to be retrofitted with these essential ASW tools. The geographic challenge. The Saint. Lawrence Gulf is vast, often shrouded in fog and subject to unpredictable weather, which severely limited the effectiveness of visual patrols. Only continuous, 24/7 radar and sonar coverage could work, demanding a huge number of platforms. To meet the deadline, the entire Canadian war machine, the Royal Canadian Navy, RCN, the Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF, and the Department of Munitions and Supply adopted an emergency, all-in strategy. The Department of Munitions and Supply became the engine of the blockade. They implemented a system of instant reprioritization, diverting materials and manpower from less critical projects to the corvette and patrol aircraft production lines. Shipyards were ordered to extend shifts and utilize every available slipway. The primary goal shifted from steady, long-term output to maximum, immediate saturation. The RCN initiated a rapid expansion of its coastal forces. Older vessels, even converted yachts and fishing trawlers, were pressed into service for local patrols, freeing up the newly built Flower-class corvettes, the primary ASW escort vessel, for the main operational zones. The RCN focused on training specialized ASW teams, rapidly moving sonar technicians and depth charge operators to the front lines. The strategy was clear: quantity over initial quality to achieve density. Meanwhile, the RCAF was tasked with creating an aerial deterrent. They recognized that while ships were slow to build, aerial patrols could be scaled up faster. They repurposed coastal airfields and scrambled to equip patrol aircraft, particularly the consolidated PBY Canso and the Lockheed Hudson, with the vital ASV radar units. This aerial mobilization was essential, as only aircraft could rapidly cover the vast expanse of the Gulf and catch the U-boats when they were most vulnerable, surfacing at night to recharge their batteries. This 90-day period was marked by frantic, almost impossible labor. In the shipyards, civilian workers pushed themselves to their limits, knowing the stakes. Designers improvised, finding ways to simplify complicated naval architecture to speed up construction. On the airfields, pilots trained intensively on the new radar equipment, learning to trust the faint electronic blips over their own eyes in the dense fog and perpetual darkness. By the end of the 90-day period, an achievement the German aces had confidently dismissed as an organizational fantasy, the St. Lawrence Seaway had been transformed. It was no longer a vast, empty expanse. It was now an integrated network of increasingly numerous corvettes, constantly patrolling, often in groups of 3 or 4, supported by the silent, electronic surveillance of RCF aircraft, flying endless search patterns. The secure hunting ground was gone, replaced by a Canadian-built death trap. The U-boat aces, who had once operated with impunity, were about to find themselves hunted relentlessly by a Navy and an Air Force that had literally been built around them in a single, desperate, and successful 90-day sprint. Early 1943. Montreal shipyards. Quebec. The yard is a cauldron of noise and sparks. running 24 hours a day through the freezing winter. Foreman Jean-Claude Dubois watches as a newly finished Flower-class corvette, the HMCS Moose Jaw, is lowered into the icy St. Lawrence River. He hasn't slept properly in 2 weeks. He hands the commander a package of cigarettes. "She's ready, Commander. Fast built, but solid steel. Go get those pirates." The commander nods, stepping onto the deck. The ship, built in a fraction of the time deemed normal, immediately turns its bow towards the Atlantic Gap, carrying the desperate hope of a nation. The Canadian government's audacious 90-day deadline to seal the St. Lawrence Seaway was less a tactical naval plan and more a complete industrial ultimatum. The goal was simple: achieve in 3 months what the enemy considered an organizational fantasy, to create a functional, integrated anti-submarine warfare ASW defense system large enough to saturate the vast Gulf. The success of this swift blockade hinged entirely on the unprecedented mobilization of Canada's industrial capacity. The naval response was spearheaded by the rapid deployment of the Flower-class corvette. This ship was a masterpiece of wartime industrial design. It was not intended to be a sleek, powerful destroyer. Instead, it was specifically engineered to be built quickly in civilian shipyards, utilizing simpler, non-specialized techniques and more readily available components. This crucial design choice allowed Canada to become the world's most prolific producer of these rugged, dependable ASW vessels. The industrial push was immense and truly a national effort. Shipyards from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast were immediately retooled for military production, utilizing modular construction and implementing relentless, round-the-clock shifts. Canadian yards began achieving a remarkable turnaround time. Corvettes that would have typically taken over a year to construct were being launched in under 6 months, sometimes even faster during the critical 90-day sprint. This astonishing speed allowed the Royal Canadian Navy, RCN, to rapidly divert newly commissioned corvettes directly into the St. Lawrence Patrol Fleet, prioritizing immediate operational density over perfect training. The industrial workforce driving this surge was equally remarkable. It included a massive number of civilian workers, many of them women, who had no prior shipbuilding experience. They learned their complex trades on the fly, driven by the profound knowledge that every ship they launched meant another layer of defense for their nation and another life saved in the treacherous convoy routes. This industrial shock wave was the true and undeniable engine of the successful blockade. These Canadian-built corvettes were not luxuriously equipped, but they carried the necessary teeth for ASW, ASDIC, sonar, and racks of depth charges. The ASDIC was the crew's vital underwater ear, allowing them to detect the U-boat's silent metallic presence. The depth charges were the punch, large canisters of explosives timed to detonate at a specific depth, generating a massive underwater shockwave intended to crush the U-boat's pressurized hull. Complementing the naval effort was the massive expansion and immediate retasking of the Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF, Eastern Air Command. To effectively seal the Gulf, the RCAF needed a continuous aerial net that could deny the U-boats the vital time they needed to surface and recharge their batteries in safety. The RCAF's mobilization focused primarily on the long-range consolidated PBY Canso, the Canadian-built Catalina, and the Lockheed Hudson bomber, both urgently converted for maritime patrol duties. These aircraft were fitted with the essential air-to-surface vessel, ASV radar, the eyes of the air patrol. The radar operators were tasked with scouring the vast, fog-bound waters for the faint, crucial blip that signaled a surfaced U-boat. The most successful air attacks often happened at night, catching the U-boats during their most vulnerable phase. Aircraft equipped with powerful, retractable searchlights would pierce the darkness, illuminating the U-boat at the last moment, blinding the crew and forcing a chaotic, rapid dive. which made the subsequent depth charge attack far more accurate and effective. Dozens of new air crews were rushed through intensive training programs, deployed to newly established coastal airfields that formed a continuous chain of coverage around the Gulf. The mission was grueling. Long, monotonous hours flying low over the frigid sea, demanding constant vigilance for the telltale wake or shadow of a U-boat. As the new corvettes and patrol planes poured into the St. Lawrence Gulf in early 1943, the arrogant German U-boat aces realized with a chilling certainty that their secure hunting ground had vanished. The Canadian blockade was taking form with astonishing speed. The easy, high-tonnage hunting days of 1942 were over, replaced by brutal, intense, close-quarters engagements. The German aces, highly skilled and supremely confident, suddenly found themselves facing a relentless, often amateur, but overwhelmingly numerous, defensive force. The battles often turned into desperate cat-and-mouse games. A corvette would gain an ASDIC contact, then aggressively rush toward the U-boat, dropping a pattern of depth charges in a precise attempt to kill the vessel. The German captain would use the sudden, shallow dives and sharp turns to attempt to break contact, relying on the sound of the exploding charges to mask their escape and deceive the persistent Allied operators. Meanwhile, aircraft, often guided by radar contact, would descend from the cloud cover and drop bombs or depth charges precisely as the U-boat was attempting its dive. The psychological toll of these relentless, non-stop air and sea attacks was immense for the German crews, forcing them to spend more time submerged, which drastically reduced their operational range, speed, and time available to effectively seek targets. The German aces, who had celebrated their earlier success in the Gulf, were now reporting intense pressure and extreme danger. They reported a sudden, overwhelming saturation of Canadian patrol vessels and aircraft. The waters that once offered safety now offered only danger and constant, exhausting pursuit. The sight of a tiny corvette stubbornly shadowing their position, or the high-pitched drone of a Canso patrol plane overhead, signaled one clear, undeniable message. Canada had committed its full, immediate industrial might to this theater, and the odds were no longer in the U-boat's favor. The 90-day deadline was successfully met, not by achieving total U-boat destruction immediately, but by creating an effective, massive saturation patrol density. The sheer number of Canadian ships and planes made the St. Lawrence too dangerous to operate in for any sustained period. The industrial shockwave had succeeded. The impossible blockade was fully complete, and the U-boat aces' reign of terror was decisively over. Late 1943, U-boat command bunker, Lorient, France. Admiral Karl Dönitz stares at the updated deployment map of the North Atlantic. The red pins marking successful U-boat sinkings have all but disappeared from the St. Lawrence Seaway area, replaced by dense blue icons representing Allied, specifically Canadian, ASW patrols. He throws his cigar onto the map. The St. Lawrence is closed. It is no longer a hunting ground. It is a graveyard. How did they achieve this industrial miracle in 90 days? We dismissed them as a sideshow. Now, they are strangling our campaign. The atmosphere is thick with the dawning realization of defeat. The successful closure of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1943, achieved by Canada's massive, coordinated industrial and military sprint, was far more than a local tactical victory. It was a strategic masterstroke that validated the power of rapid, decentralized industrial mobilization, and it delivered a fatal blow to the morale and operational confidence of the elite German U-boat aces. The 90-day deadline, initially dismissed by the Germans as an impossible fantasy, had sealed their doom in what was once their safest hunting ground. The impact of the Canadian blockade resonated on three critical levels: psychological, tactical, and strategic. The most immediate effect was the complete destruction of the German aces' morale. In 1942, they had operated with an arrogance born of impunity, sinking ships often within sight of the Canadian coastline. They viewed the Canadians as novices in ASW, relying on outdated equipment. The sudden, overwhelming presence of Canadian-built corvettes and RCF aircraft, relentless and equipped with functional sonar and radar, shattered this confidence. German U-boat commanders, forced to spend vastly more time submerged, reported extreme fatigue and stress. The constant threat of depth charges from above and the high-pitched ping of ASDIC from the escorts below meant the U-boats could no longer surface to recharge their batteries safely. Their operational tempo plummeted. The secure hunting ground had become a relentless gauntlet, and the aces realized they were no longer the predators, they were the prey. Many of the most successful German commanders were forced to transfer their operations to less intensely patrolled areas. A tacit admission that Canada had won the battle for its home waters. Tactically, the Canadian achievement proved the effectiveness of saturation density over sheer technological superiority. The RCN did not wait for perfect destroyers. They flooded the zone with Flower-class corvettes built with extraordinary speed. While single corvettes were vulnerable, a network of dozens, supported by the continuous aerial surveillance of the RCAF's Canso and Hudson aircraft, created a comprehensive deterrent. The continuous 24/7 patrol density achieved by the end of the 90-day period was the key. Any U-boat that managed to slip into the Gulf faced immediate, overwhelming attention. The ASV radar and the RCAF planes denied the U-boats the cover of night, and the corvette's sonar denied them the cover of water. The loss rate for merchant shipping in the St. Lawrence dropped dramatically, forcing the U-boat command to officially deem the entire area too costly and strategically unproductive for sustained operations. The vast Canadian industrial effort had produced a geographical exclusion zone for German submarines. The successful defense of the St. Lawrence Seaway had far-reaching global implications. The Seaway was the vital northern artery for North American industrial output, carrying raw materials like iron ore and aluminum essential for building American and Canadian tanks, planes, and ships. Had the U-boats maintained their grip, the bottleneck would have severely delayed the crucial flow of war material to the United Kingdom and, later, to the European theater after D-Day. By securing this vital route, Canada ensured two things: uninterrupted logistics. The materials pipeline for the entire Allied war effort remained intact and flowing freely. RCN maturation. The crisis forged the modern Royal Canadian Navy. The rapid need for ASW ships and training transformed the RCN from a small naval force into a massive, highly effective escort fleet that would ultimately command a substantial portion of the Battle of the Atlantic. The Canadian-built corvettes and frigates became the workhorses of the mid-ocean gap, carrying the lessons learned in the St. Lawrence to the wider Atlantic. This extraordinary achievement, sealing a major international waterway in just 3 months, is a powerful testament to the forgotten industrial might of Canada during World War II. It proves that national will and rapid industrial pivot can defeat even the most elite military units. But this is just one corner of the massive Battle of the Atlantic. If you find these untold stories of military strategy, industrial miracles, and the crucial turning points of World War II fascinating, please subscribe now and hit that notification bell. We're constantly bringing you the stories of the unsung heroes and the impossible deadlines that defined history. Also, tell us in the comments, what other industrial miracle from Tsopha do you think deserves a deep dive? The legacy of the 90-day blockade is twofold: military and industrial. On the military side, the U-boat aces never regained their foothold. The pressure exerted by the Canadian forces in the St. Lawrence, combined with the introduction of longer-range aircraft and the use of escort carriers in the mid-Atlantic, permanently tilted the balance of power. The era of the dominant U-boat ace was over, replaced by a sophisticated, coordinated Allied ASW doctrine heavily influenced by the speed and saturation tactics first employed in the St. Lawrence. On the industrial side, the achievement was nothing short of miraculous. The Canadian government had gambled on its capacity to rapidly manufacture, train, and deploy, and it won. The shipyards, powered by a non-traditional and highly motivated workforce, became synonymous with wartime efficiency. The capability to build dozens of ASW vessels in parallel, coupled with the rapid deployment of air assets, established Canada as a major industrial and military contributor to the Allied victory, far exceeding its population size. The U-boat aces' realization that they were doomed was based on a simple, terrifying calculation. Canada had managed to do the impossible. They had closed the gate, and in doing so, they not only secured their own home front, but also secured one of the most vital logistical arteries that paved the way for the ultimate Allied triumph in Europe. The industrial shockwave initiated by the 90-day challenge ensured that the war would be fought and won on Allied terms, thanks to the massive and often overlooked contribution from the North.